Hello, my name is Gerhard Fiolka. I'm a professor for international criminal law at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. I would like to welcome you to my contribution to the first edition of the LPIS V-Law review that will revolve around different topics related to the COVID-19 epidemic. So today I would like to talk to you about the consequences of not wearing a face mask in Switzerland, where this would be required by law. So we are actually talking about criminal law behind the face masks. In Switzerland, we are now required to wear a face mask on public transport and in some cantons also in supermarkets and similar shops. And one would think that if you don't wear a face mask in public places where required by law, one most certainly will be punished. For example, in France, media coverage says that not wearing a face mask will cost you 135 euros. So we have a fixed amount to pay if one does not comply with the requirement of wearing a face mask. But what it is like in Switzerland? The duty of wearing a face mask on public transportation is held in the federal ordinance on measures against COVID-19 in the particular situation. So this is a federal ordinance, and we have seen in the past few months a shift of power, of competencies from the cantons to the confederation and from the legislative organs to the administration, to the government. The hot phase of closing down shops, of the lockdown, was covered entirely by federal legislation. This was a so-called extraordinary situation, and there also was a specific ordinance. Now we are back from the extraordinary situation to the particular situation, so the cantons and the confederation share power again, but we still see a very strong concentration of power with the administration and in particular with the Federal Council. So the duty of wearing a face mask on public transport is held in an ordinance, a federal ordinance. And here we see that passengers in public transportation have to wear a face mask. It's written that they must wear a face mask. Is there any sanction for not wearing a face mask on public transportation in this ordinance? No, we don't have this. And so what is going to happen if you don't wear a face mask on the train or a bus in Switzerland? Most probably you will be required by the staff to take a face mask, to wear one, but if you don't do that, well, there is not going to be any immediate criminal law sanctions. The transport operator will have the right of refusing transportation, so staff will ask you to leave the vehicle at the next stop. And only then, only if you resist, actively resist being removed from the vehicle, if you cause any delay in the trip or anything like that, only then there will be criminal law sanctions. So we do have a duty of wearing a face mask on public transportation, but we don't really have a criminal law sanction for that. Not a direct one. It's possible that the scenario escalates, but just for not wearing a face mask, there won't be a criminal procedure. In some cantons, there is also a requirement of wearing a face mask in shops or supermarkets. For example, in the canton of Vaud, Waadtland, there has been a directive or an order about COVID-19 from the Conseil d'État, so from the government. And this directive says that operators of shops serving more than 10 customers at a time are required to prescribe the wearing of face masks in their pandemic safety concepts. So every shop or restaurant has to have a safety concept to contain the virus, and in those concepts, shopkeepers are required to have this requirement of wearing a mask. But if I go to a shop in Lausanne, the capital of the canton of Vaud, probably without a mask, then the staff will have to ask me to wear a mask. But if I don't do this, will there be a criminal law sanction? Well, if we look at this directive, we see that in case of non-adherence to this directive, the sanctions from the federal COVID-19 ordinance will take effect. We are led actually to Article 9 of this COVID-19 ordinance, but there we see, and we talk about administrative sanctions. The authorities have the competence of closing down a shop that does not have a proper pandemic safety concept. But we have no direct criminal law provision here for the customer who does not wear a face mask. Then if we look further into, again, the cantonal directive of the Conseil d'État, we see that criminal law sanctions are reserved. But if we look at this again, then we see that there are no direct criminal law sanctions for not wearing a face mask in the COVID-19 ordinance. What we have are sanctions, for example, for shop operators who do not have pandemic safety concept, and also for organizers of prohibited large public gatherings. If we go a little bit further to the canton of Geneva, neighboring canton of the canton of Vaud, then we see the situation is a different one. We also there have a duty of wearing face masks in shops. It's fixed in a so-called arrêté of the Conseil d'État. Also, again, the government has enacted this type of disposition. But here we see in Article 4 of that arrêté of the Conseil d'État of Geneva that there is a contravention who intentionally fails to comply with this arrêté is to be punished with a fine. So here we have a sanction, criminal law sanction for not wearing a mask, for example, in a shop. So we see federalism is back again. Situations vary from canton to canton. Most cantons still don't have a duty of wearing face masks, for example, in supermarkets or shops. And if we look at the direct sanctions, the picture really is very variable. So we have a fast-moving legislation that is mainly taken care of by the administration, that is mainly taken care of by the governments without the parliaments, but we don't really have a very direct link to criminal law, but a flexible one with some kind of possible escalation scenario if someone does actively resist the rule, or if someone actively, for example, resists being removed from a shop. This is interesting in several ways. First of all, it's interesting to see that obviously criminal law is not seen as a primary means of enforcing the rule on wearing face masks. Even though intuitively one would think that criminal law sanctions would be important, we have a somewhat obscure relationship between social control, mutual social control within society, and criminal law as some kind of escalation scenario. And of course, this is important from a criminological point of view, because the idea that it is possible to enforce rules with criminal law is somewhat naive. The idea of deterrence does not really work, and criminal law sanctions always come too late. They are not really suitable for preventing something or any act. Criminal law merely offers a symbolic reaction of society to some breach of a rule, and in that sense, probably criminal law is not going to be that helpful. So this is interesting that one does not merely rely on criminal law, and if we look at people on trains or buses, we notice that most people actually wear face masks, and that it probably would not be necessary to do too much policing in that field. Another thing that's a little bit more intriguing is that the risk of criminal prosecution has somewhat shifted from the consumer, from everybody, to operators of shops, for example. In the war legislation, we see that there, and also in the federal ordinance, we see that there are criminal law sanctions for shopkeepers who do not have a proper pandemic safety concept, but not for the consumer. So somewhat shopkeepers are expected to somewhat police their customers and to enforce rules on their customers, and if they don't really do that. They risk either the closing down of their shop, of their business, but also in some instances criminal prosecution. And this reminds me a bit on the legislation on money laundering, where also banks, private citizens, persons are used for enforcing rules on money laundering. Thank you very much for listening to me. I do hope that you will find interest as well in the other contributions of this first edition of the LPSV Law Review. Have a nice day, stay safe, goodbye.